and welcome. It's time for another colourful edition of A Splash of Paint, brought to you in association with the SAA, Society for All Artists. Let's dive straight in and take a closer look at some of the latest tips, tricks and techniques coming up on today's programme. We'll be shining our introducing spotlight onto the work of SAA professional artist and illustrator Michelle Webber. Murray Ince demonstrates how to paint a stunning pastel sunset in today's spectacular Try Your Hand At project. Mixed media artist Alison Board shares her top tip for adding a touch of texture into your works of art. And I'll be returning to the Derbyshire countryside to show you how to use your camera to capture depth and detail in your reference photographs. So let's start things off by shining our introducing spotlight on SAA professional artist and illustrator Michelle Webber and discover her top tip for revisiting and reworking a dry watercolour painting.
Hi, today I'm going to show you how to work back into a watercolour sky that's already dried, because quite often you paint a sky and you just haven't got time to get everything in. Watercolour dries very quickly, and if you start working on watercolour paint that's halfway between wet and dry, it can be absolutely disastrous because you get backgrounds and cauliflowers and drying lines. So I'm going to show you today that you can actually let your painting dry and rework it. I've reworked watercolour paintings 6, 7, 8 times into a sky that's been quite complex with cloud shadows and different colours, sunsets perhaps. So I'm going to show you how to do this without actually leaving drying lines on your paper. It's a really useful technique to know. So I've put my sky in here. I just washed right across with clean water, wetting the paper quite wet but not puddly. And then I worked into it in a mix of cerulean and Prussian blue. Mostly cerulean, but I just wanted that strength of the Prussian blue, which is a much stronger colour. You can see the granulation from the cerulean's quite pretty. And there's some feathering here. There's no actual backgrounds because I kept the watercolour and the water levels quite even, which is the trick to not getting too many backgrounds happening if you don't want them. So I'm working from a photograph that I took myself of a local landscape a couple of weeks ago. Now there's several things I want to do. I want to make the sky darker, particularly at the top. And I also want to put some cloud shadows in. So I'm going to start by wetting this top blue area here. In fact, I'm just going to use this larger brush. This is just a flat brush. Any standard flat brush will do. Now it's quite important that you work across bigger than the area where the paint's going to be. What you don't want is the paint getting to the edge of the waterline, because then you'll get a line of pigment where it dries. And when I say I'm putting clean water on, it has to be absolutely clean, which is why I'm using 2 jars of water. So I'm going to mix some more of the same colour mix. That's Prussian and cerulean. I'm keeping it fairly dry. What I don't want to do is go in with very drippy paint. Once you go in with very wet paint onto a surface that's starting to dry, that's when you'll get lots of backgrounds appearing. Now because I'm working on a wet surface, I'm not getting drying lines. The paint's going in quite softly. Now I'm just going to feather that edge out a little more by using a damp brush. Now I've always got kitchen paper because it's really useful for drying your brush. What I don't do is hit the paper with it. That is a technique in its own right, but I personally don't like it in skies because it leaves lots of hard-edged marks. So I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to put some more darks in further over on this next patch. It's already got a little water on, but I'm just going to extend the water further there. Again, I'm taking the water down further than I need it because I don't want the new paint to hit the edge of that waterline. The water won't leave a mark as it dries. I think people are often quite surprised that you can actually go back in, put water on top of already painted areas, and they more or less stay put. Obviously, if you really scrub them, you'd get some marks and you would lift out some of the paint. But you'll be surprised, you can really put quite a lot of water on without anything bad happening. Okay, so that area is looking nice. I'm just going to put some more blue in one or two other areas, and then I'm going to look to putting some cloud shadows in. Now you can see I'm working on stretched paper. I always work on stretched paper, and I always paint flat. I know some watercolorists paint with an easel, but I personally feel that you've got enough difficulty with watercolor and controlling the water levels without working against gravity as well, and the idea that your paint is slowly dripping down the page. That's fine if you're using a very, very wet into wet technique, but I tend to use a bit more of a precise technique. That's gone on a little strong there, so I'm just going to use a damp brush to lift out a little of that. Now watercolour dries 50% lighter than you put it on. So I may go back into this painting another 4 or 5 times until I'm completely happy with it. Now I've used cerulean and Prussian, and they're both quite cool colours, and I want to warm this painting up a little bit. So when I put the cloud shadows in, I'm going to be using a little bit of pink and some Payne's grey. So I'm using Payne's grey. It's a staining colour like Prussian blue, so it's quite strong. It's also a mixed colour. It's not a pure pigment, so each Payne's grey you get from each manufacturer will be slightly different. But one thing they all have in common is they're mixed with a lot of blue pigment. So in my palette, I keep my Payne's grey next to the blues because it behaves like a blue. If you mix yellow with it, you'll get green. If you mix pink with it, as I'm going to do, you'll get a purple. Now this pink I'm using is called quinacridone pink. It's quite hard to say. It's a synthetic colour, and it's one that I really like. But if you don't have that, you could use perhaps a rose madder, or more likely a permanent rose would do the job. So I'm just going to clean my brush, and then I'm going to go back to the clean water and apply some to the white clouds. Now mostly with clouds the shadows tend to be towards the bottom. So I can look at my picture, my photograph that I'm working from, just to give me a rough idea. But I'm just going to drop a little of this soft greyish purple I've made into some of the base areas here. It's quite important not to cover up all your white. You can get too enthusiastic about it and just be left with no white paper, which is a real shame because it's the whites that really make your watercolours glow. Now just down the bottom here I've started to go off of the waterline and I'm onto dry paper. Now that will leave a drying line. So what I'm going to do is dip my brush in the water, half dry it so I've got a damp brush, and then just run it along the edge to fade that paint out. And I may do that several times until I get the right effect. So continuing to work in these other white areas, putting shadow in. I'm doing them one at a time. So more of the Payne's grey and the quinacridone pink going in for those shadows. Now you might notice I'm using tube paints. People often ask me, my students often ask me what's better, tube paints or pan paints, and you know, everybody has their favourites. I always recommend tube paints. Lots of my students completely ignore me, but that's their prerogative. You'll find that not many professional artists use pan paints. It's not because the quality is wrong. There's nothing wrong with quality, they're just as good. It's the fact that you cannot pick up a lot of pigment. Professional artists tend to do sometimes larger paintings, work on bigger, bolder things than amateur artists who tend to sort of start off perhaps painting a little bit small. So if you're painting a big picture and you want a really big, vibrant, bold sky, pan paints just won't do it. You just can't pick up enough pigment from that little block of colour. Okay, so I'm continuing to drop my cloud shadows in. As I work down the picture, I'll decrease the amount of paint and the amount of pigment That's because as you look into the distance naturally in a landscape, you'll find that the bit by the horizon, which is the bit that's furthest away, is where the colour is faintest. And that's something sort of, it's an atmospheric effect where things are cooler and bluer and softer in the distance. And artists have been using that effect since the beginning of time. They'll sometimes even use it in still lifes where you really wouldn't see it. But by making your landscapes darker and stronger and more pigmented, your skies up the top, you'll help to create that 3 dimensions, which is what us artists are always trying to achieve. As I go down the picture, I might add a little more pink towards the horizon line. It looks quite pretty. I've taken the blue right down to the horizon because as blue is one of the colours that make up green, you can always get away, as long as it's not too dark, with putting your blue right down to the horizon, because the green will just go over the top of it and blend in naturally. I'm just going to add a little more pink to these cloud areas at the bottom here. For me, a photograph is just the starting point, and then I work from there. And I find that as the painting goes on, I'm looking less and less at the source material and more making it up as I go along, really. But then if you wanted to do an exact copy of a photograph, well, you might as well just go and take a photograph. What you're looking for is your own interpretation. There are no watercolour techniques that are right or wrong, but sometimes they can be right or wrong for a particular situation. So the more you learn about understanding the pigments and how they work on the paper, the more you will know which technique to choose for which painting. So if you'd like to see this finished painting, I'll be putting that up on my own website. It'll also go on my Facebook page and Twitter and all of those social media and any new ones they invent in the next 2 weeks. I've also got another painting to show you here. This is an example of a really complex sky that I've used these techniques in.
Great tip there for introducing complex colours and shadows into a dry watercolour painting. Thanks, Michelle. Remember, we're always keen to see how your finished works of art look. Why not share them with us and thousands of other people who share your creative passion? Simply upload examples of your work on the community section of the SAA website. Just visit saa.co.uk for details. Well, folks, time for a little break, but join us in part 2 when versatile artist Murray Ince returns to demonstrate how to use pastels to paint the perfect, stunning sunset in today's Try Your Hand At project. We'll see you very soon.